25 years ago at the turn of the century, whereas the Western European thinkers mistook the previous 30 years for what would be the future forever, Poland, with its history and knowledge and terrain and place, didn't really make that mistake. I personally believe that Poland is the sort of heavyweight of that whole region and increasingly becomes important to NATO. In the event of a Trump presidency, it's unlikely, but he could pull America out of NATO, at which point NATO collapses, at which point Poland is in serious trouble. Poland is the highway. You can accelerate through it. Otherwise, you're going through the water of the Baltic or over the Carpathians. The dismantling of the ISS, which will begin in 2028, I think, is really sad because it's such a great symbol of what we can do together. But there's not going to be an international space station symbolic of us going out into infinity as humanity.
I would like to ask you about the current events in Ukraine, because you've been writing for many years about international affairs and how geography influences them. So do you think this kind of situation that we have right now could have been predicted before?
Yes. I mean, not exactly this scenario, but a version of it. I did say in 2015 that the Russians were not finished with Ukraine, and if they thought they could do something, they would do something. And there is a geographic explanation. It's one of many reasons why they've behaved the way they have. It does not excuse it in any way, but you have to understand the Russian perspective. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to understand it. And the geographic element of this is, A, they lack a warm water port, which is why they felt so strongly about Crimea and Sebastopol. But also it's the terrain and the history. And this is where Poland comes in, because it is true that the Swedes went through Poland to get to Russia, that Napoleon took this route, that the Germans took the route in 1914 and again in 1941. And from the Russian perspective, they want to block that route, and they want to have what they regard as a buffer, which is Belarus and Ukraine, and that flat land that is Belarus and Ukraine, between them and the people in the West. Now, again, it does not excuse it, but it partially explains it.
So, in your opinion, which factor is more important, like human will or the geographical determinism? Because it's just a very sad conclusion for Poland that we are in a place in Europe, in the world, that is always subjected to such events, right?
Poland is the highway. You can accelerate through it. Otherwise, you're going through the water of the Baltic or over the Carpathians. But I don't think you can say that one factor is more important than the other. Human will is important because Putin did not have to invade Ukraine, but I would argue he was imprisoned in his head by nationalism, by his strange ideas about the world, but also by his geography and the history that has happened on that geography. So from his perspective, you put the three things together. His choice based on his reading of what has happened in that land in front of him over the past few hundred years.
So what would you recommend to the people of Poland, but also to the decision makers in Poland, how to prepare and how to actually live in such a place, which you call the highway?
Well, I think Poland has actually done quite a good job of preparing, and this began before the invasion of 2022. I mean, you read what happened in the years before on the annexation of Crimea much better than they did in Western Europe. You have been preparing your military. I personally believe that Poland is the sort of heavyweight of that whole region and increasingly becomes important to NATO. And the whole shift of NATO is now weighted more on the north, especially with Sweden and Finland now. So I think psychologically and intellectually, I think Poland has been in a better place than what I regard as the very naive Western Europeans. I'd go as far as to say, even as, let's say, 25 years ago, at the turn of the century, whereas the Western European thinkers mistook the previous 30 years for what would be the future forever, Poland, with its history and knowledge and terrain and place, geographic place, didn't really make that mistake.
But do you really think it was a mistake in terms of the Western moves in the recent 30 years or perception? Because let's take the position of the UK, right? You are not very endangered by Russia, as much, maybe not as much as Poland, Germany as well, but they really had a good interest in cooperating with Russia if it comes to resources.
I'd accept that perhaps some mistakes were made. The enlargement of NATO, I think you can support on the grounds of a democratic country. The populations, let's say it's Czechoslovakia, now Czechia and Slovakia, the political parties went to their peoples after the Cold War and said, we want to be the government, and one of our policies, we want to join NATO. And every single one of them said, we agree. So I think you can support it. Now, perhaps it could have been finessed differently, and Poland is an example. There could have been an agreement that you're in NATO, you have Article 5, we will defend you, but we will say to the Russians, we promise we're not going to station any troops permanently, we're not going to mothball any heavy equipment there, because we know you feel nervous. We could have been a bit more delicate. But again, this doesn't excuse the Russian actions. We were not a threat to Russia. We invited them into the Partnership for Peace. We even gave them an office at the NATO headquarters in Brussels to try to say, come and let's talk, let's try and have a partnership. But this came up against this idea in the Russian mind of us as a threat, which, as I've said, you can understand given their history, but Putin can sell this idea of be afraid of the Western hordes advancing towards us to his population because of that history and because he controls the media. You ask why Britain has taken a fairly strong line on this Ukraine situation. There is the more philosophical aspect to it of standing by a fellow, albeit very flawed, European democracy. There is the idea that if you don't stand up now when you have seen borders changed by force, you will have to intervene later on. And that's the real key, because Britain for 400 years has stood off from the mainland of Europe, watched the balance of power, and when one power begins to grow and could dominate the whole continent, and consequently Britain, at that point it moves.
They supported the weaker side.
Yes. So when France is big and powerful, you ally with other people. If it looks like it's Spain, you do. If it looks like it's Germany, you do. And when it looks like it's Russia, you do. So yes, there is this element that we philosophically, we support fellow democracies, but there is also the hard power of it is not in Britain's interest for Russia to dominate the continent.
So now I would like to ask you about the guarantees that the US has given to Poland and to the Eastern flank and Europe, but also for the partners in Indo-Pacific. But because we see that there are various places where the conflict is really tense, like between different countries, for example, Taiwan and China, Ukraine and Russia, but also in the Middle East. And I think the US has limited resources. So do you think that those guarantees or this support is credible?
I think NATO support for Poland at the moment absolutely is credible. It is you are protected by Article 5, as are we. And in the current situation, we would stand by that. The problem comes down the line, whereas if we do not pay our own way, as Europe as a whole within NATO, the Americans, who are exasperated with us, some of us, most of us actually, they will not forever pay to protect Europe, even if it is in their interests, when they have something that they regard as more important, the Indo-Pacific. So at the moment, I think they would stand by the safeguards and the guarantees. In the event of a Trump presidency, it's unlikely, but he could pull America out of NATO, at which point NATO collapses, at which point Poland is in serious trouble because the rest of Europe is not prepared. If it's Trump, he could even weaken NATO by suggesting he might not help, or not appointing a new NATO commander, or downgrading the amount of American troops. You know, there's various things he could do which would weaken NATO, and that's the biggest danger. If NATO is weakened, Russia is emboldened.
But what if NATO is not weakened and it's still, let's say, united, but, for example, the American resources are limited because back then, in 20 years, they were presenting that they are able to wage 2 major wars, and now it's 1.5, but some analysts say it's even less than 1. So we see tensions in the Middle East, but many analysts, they say that in 2028 China will be able to conquer Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So what happens in this scenario in the eastern flank of Europe?
As long as NATO is united, it really depends on the scenarios. In the scenario of in a few years' time, NATO is still united and the Americans are still committed to it, I know that they can no longer, they think, fight 2 major wars simultaneously. They can fight like 1.5. So if in the unlikely event that they were at war with China, they would be able to have limited resources, but even a limited American engagement in Europe with the Europeans is far superior to Russia. I mean, the disparity between the power of the NATO, military power of the NATO countries and the military power of Russia is enormous. So even if the Americans were busy elsewhere, NATO has more than enough to deal with Russia. The issue, as long as NATO is united, is not kit, technology, and people. It's willpower. Without it, NATO is going to crumble, and Russia has not finished. With it, Russia is not so foolish as to attempt to take on any of the NATO countries as long as they believe Article 5 would be triggered.
Yeah, I think Ukraine has proven that the human will is the most important factor in war. But let us now take a look into the Middle East. We've seen some, let's say, dangerous events. Iran was attacking Israel before. Back then, Israel attacked an embassy of Iran in Syria. So do you think it is possible that a major conflict will appear in the Middle East in the upcoming months or years?
Hostage to fortune making a prediction in the Middle East because it's so volatile. But as things stand, I think all sides can still be talked down back to a level of low-level, constant intensity, but not an all-out war. The problem is that because it's so volatile, the escalatory ladder has got small rungs. It's very easy to go up them quickly. But at the moment, in the near future, the Israelis are very busy. There is a threat on their northern border with Hezbollah, which I think may grow. The Iranians don't really want a war because their military, because it would be an air war mostly, and their military, their air force is 30 years behind the Israeli Air Force. So as long as wiser heads prevail, it doesn't have to be a wider Middle East war. Anyway, who would fight it? The Israelis would, the Iranians would, some of their proxies would. They've been doing that for 20 years. It's only a case of how high up that ladder you go. And at the moment, I think they can keep it at a certain level.
But maybe the Iranians, they think that America is busy with Taiwan, with Russia. So they are somehow allying with Russia, right? They're selling the Shahed drones, for example. So maybe they think this is the time to get rid of Israel.
There are hawks in Tehran that would want to seize this opportunity to try and destroy Israel, but I don't think they can. They don't have the capacity to do that. And you've seen the reaction from the G7 countries to the missile attack on Israel. It's pretty solid. And the French, the British, and the Americans and the Jordanians all joined in defending Israel. They were also defending themselves. The powers arrayed against Iran are vastly superior. And you talk about the Americans being busy, keeping an eye on Taiwan, active in the Ukraine war. 20% of their capacity just in the Middle East is enough for them to nullify Iran. You're talking a quantum leap ahead. One aircraft carrier group from the Americans is more than the Iranians have.
So let us now take a look from another side. Do you think that peace in the Middle East is possible? Because we've seen it somewhere like on the horizon after the Abraham Accords, but after the Hamas attacked Israel, I think it all collapsed like immediately.
I don't think it collapsed. October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel showed us how easy it is to wreck steps forward towards peace. The Abraham Accords signed by UAE and others, Bahrain, were the stepping stone towards Saudi Arabia joining and making its peace with Israel, at which point the governments of the Middle East are mostly at peace with Israel, and therefore isolating more Iran. So it's in Iran's and Hamas's interest to wreck that. But what happened was none of the Abraham Accord countries broke relations. They all still have relations with Israel. The Saudis are on the record as saying they would still like to look at moves towards this. Two-state solution is part of the deal for them. So that track, it's still possible to progress down it. Now, will there be peace in the Middle East? It seems doubtful. There are too many competing factions. Houthis don't want peace. The Iranians are still trying to project their power across the whole region. Syria remains essentially a failed state with a bunch of warlords. The Turks are still unhappy about Kurdistan, including the Iraqi. I mean, you look at all these flashpoints, and while I think it's possible that Israel can make its peace with most of the Arab Sunni states, there's more to the Middle East than that. And these firefights that break out across the region, there's a long way to go to solve those.
All right, let's leave the Middle East and let's go to Taiwan and China. I will ask you about the words of William Burns. He's the chief of CIA.
Yeah.
He once said that in 2028, China will be able to, let's say, undertake some military actions to reunite Taiwan. I think this is also a very symbolic date because this is going to be the year of 100th anniversary of People's Liberation Army. So do you think China will do such a thing, like, for example, encircling with its ships the island?
Bill Burns of the CIA said he thinks they'll be ready to do it by 2028. That's different to doing it. You know, I agree, militarily, without an American intervention, they'll be able to do it. But making the decision to do it is monumental. So the scenario is, let's say, 2028. If they've made that decision, they have to cross 120 miles of open water, rough sea. They have to come in on the front of the island where there's about 5 different landing beaches. That's not very many. So in other words, I know exactly where they're going to land. So that will be very fiercely opposed. The time taken to assemble the force to do this, 400,000 men, hundreds of boats, vessels, will be months. So you'll see it coming for months, giving the Americans more than enough time to make their decisions and position themselves. Not to take the decision that they're going to fight, but to put themselves in the position where they could fight. So at that point, you've got 120 miles, rough seas, we know where you're going, we know you're coming, the Americans are in position. It's quite a decision to then say, we're going to go and do it. Now, I'm not arguing because I don't know if the Americans actually would fight, but neither do the Chinese know. So for all those reasons, and their economy will probably still be having problems in 2028, for all those reasons, put me in the Chinese Politburo, I'm arguing against it.
But I don't only mean a full-scale invasion, but for example, a blockade, a naval blockade that may also happen.
If we're talking about blockade, that is several rungs down in danger for the Chinese. I mean, it's problematic. They still have to wonder what will the Americans do, because you're doing a blockade in one of the major international sea lanes of the world for trade. But it's much harder to sell, for the Americans to sell it to their politicians, to the military, to their population, of getting militarily involved on a blockade as opposed to an invasion. So yes, I think that that is a more plausible scenario if the Chinese leadership thinks it needs a big win. It could risk that.
What would that mean for the United States, but also for the global economy in terms of semiconductor industry, which is located in Taiwan?
There would immediately be a bump in the worldwide economy, but that would also mean that a decision needs to be made. Are you going to run the blockade? Now, the Americans are in a very strong position. The Japanese are with them, the Philippines are with them. When you look at the map, what's each side of Taiwan? Japan, Okinawa, tens of thousands of American troops, and a naval base in Tokyo Bay. And on the other side, the Luzon Strait, the Philippines, where the Americans have basing rights. So they've got a lot of options. We don't care if you say there's a blockade. We are going to go to those ports. And it would have to be an air blockade as well. So again, it's difficult for the Chinese, because are they going to enforce their blockade if the American Navy is running through it? Or an American commercial ship? Are they going to attack it? These are tough decisions. And the Americans are in a very strong naval position. So, but without doubt, there would be a huge bump in the world economy, because you're talking about this trading area. And also, yes, the semiconductor chip industry, you know, I mean, I forget the percentages, but a huge percentage of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips are made there, which is why, by the way, the Americans are building 2 factories in America with the Taiwanese to try to circumvent that problem.
And also in Germany, as far as I know. Yeah.
Well, the Germans are very good at this, but the Dutch are also brilliant at it. But yeah, there's no question that if you took the Taiwanese advanced super semiconductor chips out of the equation, there is immediately a worldwide shortage.
Do you think it may harm also China? Because they are also dependent on the industry that is located on Taiwan.
No, they're not. Well, they are and they aren't. Biden passed a law 2 years ago, and the Taiwanese have signed up to it, and so have the Dutch last year. They don't get anything above a certain level. So China makes, sorry, this is not really for the answer. It's China makes its own semiconductors, but they're not very good. They're not really high-end. The only high-end ones are pretty much Belgian, Taiwanese, a little bit American, and the Dutch. And all of those have agreed they are not going to sell the technology or transfer it. So the Chinese don't actually get much of hardly any high-end stuff from Taiwan. They'd love to. They'd love to have that factory. There's a joke in Taiwan. If they come, head for the factory. It's the only place they won't bomb.
And how about strategic position of Taiwan for the Americans, for example? General MacArthur, he once called Taiwan the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Exactly. So, do you think it is still important for the Americans, for example, in terms of Chinese submarines that can operate in the Pacific Ocean?
Geography is really important here still, always will be. The first island chain starts just above Japan, comes down through the Japanese islands, then there's Taiwan, then there's the Philippines, then it goes all the way down to Malaysia. There's gaps in between these islands, obviously. They are very easily plugged by either long-range artillery or by the Navy. So in other words, in front of China is a wall of islands and Navy, which actually blocks their access into the Pacific. So they're geographically at a great disadvantage as long as that first island chain remains united and allied with America, which it is. So, like between Okinawa and Taiwan, that's very easy to block. Between Philippines and Taiwan, the Luzon Strait, very easy to block. Now, Chinese submarines can try and circumvent that, but you don't have huge amounts of cargo on submarines. In the military sense, this is partly where Australia and the AUKUS deal comes in. I mean, it won't kick in for several years, but the Americans and the British and the Australians are going to together build Australian nuclear-powered, not armed, submarines. And the reason they're doing that is they're pointing them towards the first island chain. So geographically, China's actually, in naval terms, in a quite confined position.
Just as Russia.
Yeah,
during the Cold War.
I mean, they've both got options with their land borders, but navy-wise, I mean, the Russians are in a terrible position as far as naval power is concerned. You have to go through the ice pack to get up the Arctic and then round. And only then you reach the North Sea. You come out of the Baltic, there's about 9 NATO powers you go past, and then there's the Skagerrak Strait. And even then you're into the North Sea where the British are. You want to come out the Black Sea, the Bosphorus is 1 mile wide and controlled by Turkey, a NATO power. You've already had to go past Romania and Bulgaria, NATO powers. When you get into the Aegean, there's Greece, very good navy. And then on you go past France and Spain. Yeah, the Russians, naval-wise, are in a very tight position.
So that also shows why Taiwan is so important for the Chinese. Okay, but let's now leave Earth and go into space, because you wrote a book about space geography, if I may call it like this. So I would like to ask you about the paradigms, 2 paradigms that we have in analyzing, or main paradigms that we have in analyzing foreign affairs. Liberal one and realistic one, and which one, in your opinion, is more suitable for describing the current space race that we are observing right now?
I like the liberal paradigm. The liberal paradigm is that we're all earthlings, so we go out there into this very hostile area together, and we cooperate, and we realize how dangerous it is, and there are examples of that. International Space Station, Russians and Americans still travel to it together. We have agreed that nobody can own space. And this is all good. And then there's the realistic one, where, yes, all those good things are happening, and medical experiments that will benefit us all, but competition for satellites, satellite space, competition for geosynchronous orbit, competition for the resources of the moon, potential for arming satellites. And I think the realism will kick in. Already we're seeing the agreements of the 1960s breaking down as people realize both the military and economic advantages of being in space and being on the moon and competing. And I think the moon will be the most competitive place, because if, and it is an if there really are vast resources there of the precious metals and other things that we need for our 21st century technology here, lithium is lignite, things like that. And secondly, if it is economically viable to mine it, at that point, there'll be huge competition for getting there, setting up and saying, this is mine. And if the two ifs come true, then the realist scenario is by far the more likely.
So do you think after the termination of the International Space Station, there will be another project in the future resembling this one?
Yeah, the dismantling of the ISS, which will begin in 2028, I think, is really sad, because it's such a great symbol of what we can do together. And, you know, the Russians and the Americans working together, and many other countries.
Impossible in the
current climate.
Yeah. In the current climate, but in the past as well, like during the Cold War, maybe.
In the Cold War, you saw the handshake in space when the Soyuz and the Apollo docked. The airlock opened, and the Soviet cosmonauts and the American astronauts shook hands in space. These are examples like the ISS of what is possible when we cooperate, and that's why it's such a sad symbol of where we are now, the competition in space, that it's going to be dismantled and not properly replaced. The versions will be the newer Chinese one with Russian assistance, which is a sovereign space station, essentially. And then the Americans are going to build an Artemis one, which is essentially an American one with help from a range of other countries. But there's not going to be an international space station symbolic of us going out into infinity as humanity, as opposed to going out as Chinese, Russians, Americans, or Poles.
Yeah, so if you say that this is highly likely that in the future nations will just compete in the space, not cooperate, so I assume that the Americans and the Chinese will compete mostly about the resources which are located on the moon. But an advice to countries like Poland, so how can we be a part of this race? Like maybe we can join one of the sides?
Well, Poland's already picked a side, in essence, in joining the Artemis Accords. This is a bilateral agreement you have with the Americans, and they have that same agreement with 32 other countries. So that gives you a foothold that makes you part of what is happening. It means that if you did develop the technology, you know, you could also look at the commercial interests that are there. You are in partnership with the leading space power. You're not in partner, but that means essentially you'll be in competition with the other leading space power, China. So in essence, you've made a choice. You've picked a side.
Do you think for countries as Poland, is it possible to not pick their side, but to develop your own technology like Israel did? They are capable of launching rockets. They are capable of displacing satellites in space.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if Israel can do it, I mean, they are called startup nation, and they're brilliant at tech and all the rest of it. But the UAE, and it has the money because of the oil and the gas, of course, to do it. But they are examples of if you have a vision and you follow it, and you have the money and the brain power. And I think Poland does. Whether it has Does it need its own launch capacity? Hardly anybody has launch capacity. I mean, the British should have it next year. A commercial company is looking at being able to launch CubeSats direct ascent from a base in Scotland, which would be the first launch capacity in Europe if it happens. So you could follow that path, and Poland is certainly capable of it. Is it a good resource of your money? I think you're probably better off in partnerships. I mean, I'm not doing Poland down. I believe Poland, I used to argue that it was the coming country in Europe. I think it's arrived. I think people have woken up to the weight of Poland economically within the EU and now within NATO. But it's interesting that all those things are done in partnership, and that's probably the way ahead.
I have two more questions. One of them is, do you think that cheap commercial flights will be possible any soon? I mean, we see, for example, cheap airlines. It was impossible like 20 years ago for us to travel that easily along the world. And do you think that it is possible in terms of space?
At the moment, if you want to go to space for only a few minutes, $400,000. Okay, that's a pretty small segment of the population you're selling to.
Unless you're selling your house to do it.
But when the Wright brothers took off in what's called the Wright brothers flyer, which we know as Kitty Hawk, it was only 30 years from that moment before more Americans were traveling by plane than by train. 30 years. Now, I don't know the time frame, but I do know the costs will come down. You know, once it was impossible, unless you're a government astronaut, then if you got $400,000, the costs will come down with reusable rockets, other technology. So I think it's quite possible within a decade it'll become available not just to the super rich, but to the very rich. But for most of us, we're talking a long time.
Would you like to go yourself to space?
I would love to go to space. Give me $400,000, I'm going. And hopefully coming back.
I wish I had this amount of money. Okay, so my final question is, do you think that this kind of, let's say, multinational cooperation in space after this realistic era will be possible, like in the maybe distant future?
Yes. I'm a great believer in Star Trek, where, you know, not only is humanity united to go out there as one, but we're going out there with the Vulcans as well and lots of others. It's great. So I think we're going to have to go through this period of intense competition. And then we're going to realize, you know, we really need to talk to each other. And a good example, perhaps, is the nuclear arms race, where each side went hell for leather to get as many warheads as possible and then realized, oh, we need to talk to each other. And they did. We'll go through something similar with space. And I think the end product is the further out we go, the more we realize we need to cooperate. And it's funny, you know, most of the recent big sci-fi films, they're chock-a-block full of cooperation, usually between the Americans and the Chinese. If we put together the best of what we have, I think we're stronger. And I think that is probably a form of cooperation will emerge after quite a few years of intense competition.
So I think this is a very optimistic end for our interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was lovely to talk to you and very interesting.